Well, here we are in the second Sunday of our walk through Lent with Jesus. Lent, season of honesty about our sin, truth-telling, about the many ways we fall short of God's goodness. Lent, season of repentance and lament. Lament? Today when we think of mourning, it's usually in response to death or loss. Most of us never weep except at funerals. Back in the days of American revivalism, though, when Christianity spread like wildfire across the American frontier, at most of the revivals, they had what they called the mourner's bench. That was a church pew or a bench where repentant sinners sat long enough to think about their sin, to weep, to mourn for their sin. Today, we're more apt to mourn for the loss of someone we love, or more than we mourn for all the ways that our sin, our rebellion, our infidelity has caused God sadness. What causes you joy? What moves you to laugh with delight? Old Abbott and Costello movies? Or when your favorite team wins a national championship? When the guy and the gal whom you were rooting for finally overcome all odds and fall into one another's arms and they go off to live happily ever after? You know, you can tell a great deal about people by what they consider to be humorous, funny, and delightful. And of course the converse is true as well, because as you grieve, when are you moved to tears? Your favorite team doesn't win the national championship. You don't get the job you know would be perfect for you. Someone you love is no longer there in your life. Joy, laughter, delight are fine indicators of what we love and what we value. But I believe grief, tears, lament are unfailing indicators of what we value most. Our most cherished people, our deepest loves. My mother grew up as a veritable orphan. When my mother's mother died, her farm family was very poor, and perhaps that's the reason why my mother was immediately, at age 5, bundled off to live with a variety of relatives. However, my mother sometimes wondered if her father had sent her away because somehow he blamed her for the death of his wife, her mother. In later life, my mother made attempts to get close to her father, my grandfather. Most of those attempts were rebuffed. Though my mother was nice about it all, we all could tell that my grandfather was not one of her favorite people. Therefore, my sophomore year of college, when my mother called to tell me that my grandfather had died, I was surprised. Well, considering the history she had had with my grandfather, I was surprised that my mother was crying. Her tears were revealing. My mother rarely, almost never wept about anything. And I wondered, was my mother crying from a genuine sense of loss? Maybe she loved my grandfather more than I'd thought. Perhaps she was weeping out of a sense of regret, sad at what might have been, but now would never be. Why is my mother, who rarely weeps over anything, weeping for this father whom she barely knew? I remember asking that of myself after the phone call and thinking, well, maybe that's why she's weeping. She's lost the father whom she barely knew. Now, I don't know if Jesus actually broke down and cried in this morning's gospel. I do know that Luke says that Jesus laments over the state of Jerusalem. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you, how often have I wanted to gather your people just as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, But you didn't want that. Look, your house is abandoned. Matthew says Jesus wept over Jerusalem, thus giving us the shortest verse in the Bible. Luke doesn't say Jesus wept, but it's hard to imagine Jesus uttering these words without tears in his eyes. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you, how often have I wanted to gather your people just as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings? You didn't want that. It's revealing. Jesus is on the road out in Galilee. He's a long way from Jerusalem, but already the storm clouds are gathering. Oh, Herod's out to kill you, warned the Pharisees. Jesus has a premonition of the rejection that he will suffer in Jerusalem, the capital city. They tell Jesus that Herod, most powerful man in Judea, is out to kill him. Jesus just brushes that off, dismissing Herod as nothing but a fox. But then Jesus falls into real lament, grief, mourning, not over Herod's plans for him, not over his eventual fate in Jerusalem, but over the state of Jerusalem itself. Oh, Washington, Washington, what high hopes I had for you, with what promise you began this century, and now look how you have squandered your future. See how you have disregarded the judgments of God. Oh, I wonder if it was something like that. Jesus speaks of Israel's prophets. Who were Israel's prophets? Spokespersons for God, human beings who were given unusual insight into God's purposes. A consistent message of the prophets was, God delivered you from Egyptian slavery. God made out of you a great people. And look how you squandered your inheritance. Look how you broke God's covenant with you. Prophet Jeremiah said he wished he had a river in order to shed all the tears that arose in him over the state of God's people. The prophets were willing to call even the powerful into account, reminding kings and high priests that they had served under a just and righteous God who would hold them accountable for their abuses of power, particularly their abuses toward the poor and the vulnerable. Sometimes the powerful people heeded the prophets' warnings and judgments, and sometimes they ridiculed, ignored, and dismissed those judgments. Maybe Jesus has the prophets on his mind because of Herod's threats against him. That's the way the powerful have often reacted to the judgments of God, like Herod reacted. And it's enough to make Jesus weep. Jesus laments what might have been. He laments that the people and their rulers have sunk to replication of the worst aspects of their history rather than following their better angels. Lent has traditionally been a season of repentance. The church gives us 40 days to mourn all the ways that we've disappointed ourselves and disappointed God with the way that we've lived, the things that we've done and left undone. And when you look at the state of our lives, as well as our nation, our world, there's a lot to mourn. But our gospel lesson today is not about our grief. It's not about our tears. Presumably, there were lots of inhabitants of the capital city in Jerusalem who went about with happy faces. They believed in putting a good face on everything. Things are going well for them and their families. Oh, why shouldn't they rejoice? Jesus looked at Jerusalem, Jerusalem the golden, and he wept. He had come together all to himself, like a mother hen gathers her chicks. And yet, we responded to his open-handed love with cries of, "Crucify him!" Now, I'm not going to attempt to give you my chosen list of subjects for lamentation. I could, because I think there's a long list of ways in which we've caused God grief. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take just a moment and ponder. If Jesus thought about our town today, would he rejoice that we have been faithful to his way, or would he lament? You've rejected and derided those prophetic truth tellers who dared to call you to account and tell you the truth. I wanted to gather you close to me as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you wouldn't. And now's the time for tears. It's Lent. Time for tears. Back when I served as the junior high rep to the official board of Buncombe Street Methodist Church, Billy Graham announced a citywide crusade in our town, Little Greenville, South Carolina. The whole town mobilized. Every church in town was canvassed for their support. At the church's board meeting, grown-ups debated our congregation's participation. Our preacher told the board, "Oh, what a great opportunity this was for our church, for our whole town, Billy Graham." Our preacher said he'd been meeting for the last few months with a group of clergy from other churches in town, and he'd rarely witnessed such excitement. The board was having none of it, though, and the board refused to rejoice with our pastor at the prospect of a citywide crusade. "Hey, a bunch of Baptists trying to get a leg up on us," gasped one of the board members. Graham says there's going to be no separation of the races during the meetings." Well, that did it. The board voted to protect our church from Graham-esque miscegenation and racial mixing, and refused participation. Well, after the meeting, I, the teenage representative to the board, as I exited a side door to catch the legally, racially segregated Greenville bus to go home, down a dark church hallway, I heard weeping. I crept down the hall. Light shone from a half-open door. I peeked in. There was our pastor, Dr. DuBose, a grown-up. He was sobbing. He was holding his head in his hands. I'll tell you, keeping up with the disruptive, demanding movements of a holy and righteous God, it's not for the faint of heart. Still, I thank God that at an early age, I got to see what makes preachers cry.